So on Daf Nun Vavam and Beis, there's a Mishnah towards the bottom of the Amud, and we'll give a little bit of an introduction to this Mishnah. The halacha is that if a Bas Kohen, who normally could eat Truma, and that's what she'll do while she's in Beis Aviyah, but if she gets married to a non-Kohen, a Yisrael, then she ceases to eat Truma. And that halacha, as we'll derive from a pasuk, applies even if she was only an arusa, even before Nisuin. So we have a case of a Bas Kohen, shenis arso li Yisrael, and she loses her ability to eat Truma. Again, that's only a temporary situation because right now she's married to Yisrael. If he dies or divorces her, she goes back to her Beis Aviyah, her original state, and she continues as she did before the marriage to eat Truma. Now, this halacha that she goes back to eat Truma is derived later on from a pasuk. The pasuk tells us that Bas Kohen kisia, almana ugrusha, v'zera ein la, v'shava el beis aviyah kinureha, milechem aviyah tocha. So the pasuk indicates that a Bas Kohen, when she becomes an almana or a grusha, if she doesn't have any children from that marriage, then she goes back to Beis Aviyah and she eats milechem aviyah, which means from Truma. However, that's only when she becomes an almana or a grusha. That's what the Torah says. What happens before she becomes an almana and a grusha? So that's a different pasuk. The pasuk says, "Ubas Kohen kisia leish zar, he betrumas kodshim lo socha." If a Bas Kohen is married to an ish zar, then she doesn't eat trumas kodshim. And the pasuk uses the word kisia, and the Gemara later on is going to say that the word sia means havaya or kinyan. And that's a reference to Erison. So from the moment of Havaya, which is Kiddushin, she, the Bas Kohen, becomes disqualified for eating Truma. But again, as we said before, that might very well be a temporary situation, because when her marriage to a Yisrael terminates with either Almanus or she becomes a Grusha, then Shava el Beis Aviyah, she goes back to Beis Aviyah to eat Truma. But all this is conditional, says the Torah, on Zera Ein La. She has no children from the Yisrael that she was married to. Okay. That's introduction number one. Now, introduction number two is the case of a Bas Yisrael who doesn't eat Truma. If she gets married to a Kohen, the Torah says that she's allowed to eat Truma as long as she's married to the Kohen. And that's also pretty much explicit in the pasuk. It says, "V'Kohen ki yikne nefesh kinyan kaspo hu yochal bo," which means that the kinyan kaspo of a Kohen is allowed to eat Truma. And a woman who's niskadshel a Kohen is classified as a kinyan kaspo, and she's allowed to eat Truma. Our Mishnah is going to address a very complicated situation. On the one hand, she's a Bas Kohen. On the one hand, she's a Bas Yisrael, so she doesn't get Truma. But on the other hand, she is kinyan kaspo of a Kohen. The Torah says she can eat truma, even though she's a Bas Yisrael. But what's the monkey wrench here? The marriage to this Kohen is illegitimate. Why? For one of two reasons. Either because she's an almana and he's the Kohen Gadol, or she's a grusha and he's a Kohen Hedjot. So there's a psul in the Kinyan Kaspa, and that's called Shomeres LaAvera. Although she's only at the state of Erison now, there was no Be'ila yet, no intimacy. So that psul of Chalola doesn't set in, but she's in a state of Shomeres Libia Surah. What's the exact language? Is it? Did I get the language right? Just give me a second. Shomeres Lebias Avera. That's the language. Now, what does this mean, Shomeres Lebias Avera? Once we get to Nisuin and the Bia, she becomes a Chalola. Now, the din of a Chalola is a twofold halacha. Number one, she cannot eat Truma. And number two, she cannot marry a Kohen. So in those two cases that we mentioned, Almana lekohen gadol and Grusha lekohen hedjot, she shomeres lebias avera, on a doraisa level, she can still eat truma. Why? Because there's kinyan kaspo, and she's not a halal. There was no bia. But the Rabbanan pasaled her for truma because after the Nisuin, the Torah itself would pasal her for truma, because then she becomes a halal. So the Rabbanan made a gzera that already from Shas Kiddushin, she forfeits her legal status to eat truma. Okay, now we have a third introduction. What's the third introduction? Although on a doraisa level, a Bas Yisrael can eat truma if she's married to a Kohen, even from Erison, because that's called Kisiya. Havaya is Kinyan, which means Kinyan Kaspo. And that's called Bas Kohen Kitia Le'ish. Now, just 1 second. Bas Kohen Kitia. It's like there's so many different psukim here. Let me just. Oh, Kohen, here's the pasuk. Kohen, just want to underline this. Kohen ki yikne nefesh, kinyan kaspo, hu yochal bo. Okay. So again, what's the situation here? This is a girl who's not a Kohen, not a Kohenes, not a Bas Kohen. She's living with her father and her brothers and her sisters. But she's me'ureses to a Kohen. The Torah says she can eat truma. The Rabbanan said she's not allowed to eat truma until Nisuin. Why not? So the Gemara gives two answers to that question. It's the Gemara in Masechet Ksubis on Daf Nun Zayin Amud Beis. One answer is We're afraid that she's living in the house of her father, and she'll feed the truma accidentally to one of the members of her family. That's an Isa Misa, like Misa B'dei Shemayim Zaros. The other sheet in the Gemara is that we're afraid Shemiyimtza Baal Habal Mum, that maybe after they clinch the intimacy, he'll find out that she has a mum. And that makes the Kedushin into Kedushay Tos. So she was never married to a Kohen, and now she has the status of a Zar eating Truma. So we can't let that happen. After the Suin, we assume the marriage is forevermore, until death do us part, because he finds out whether she has a mum or not. And Baruch Hashem, she has no mum, everything is good. But she cannot eat Truma midarabanan after Erisin, before Nisuin, even though Doraisa she has the status of Kinyan Kaspa. Okay. For one of two reasons. Now, we introduce another concept called Higia Zmana. From Erisin till Nisuin, they set a time period, which is usually 12 months. And now the 12 months passed, the time elapsed, and the Kohen did not yet take her into the chuppah for whatever reason. But he's dilly-dallying, or whether he did deliberately or not deliberately. So the halacha is from Higia Zmana, can she eat truma? And believe it or not, there's something called the Mishnah Rishona, and the Mishnah Rishona says there in Masechet Ksubis that Mishigia Zmana li Nase Ocheles B'Truma. We go back to the Doraisa halacha of Kinyan Kaspa with Hagazman. That's called the Mishnah Rishona. And the Gemara in Ksubis explains the Mishnah Rishona according to both shitas. If midrabanan, we were afraid that she would be feeding her household, members of her father's house, truma, then once he gives man, chayav b'mizonos, the Baal at that point has to support his wife. So what he does is he sets up a separate house, takes her out of the house of her father, and that's where he's going to, quote unquote, feed her. Why? He doesn't want to feed her in her own house, because then the members of the household are going to enjoy the benefit of his money. He's spending a lot of money here. So there's no longer a chashash that she might feed the truma to the members of her household. That's the Mishnah Rishona according to one interpretation. The other interpretation is that before he starts shelling out for mizonos and signing the checks and giving her the credit card, he's going to check her out, not personally, because that's not sneers, he's not married to her yet. He's going to have someone else, and he's going to appoint a woman to check her out, make sure she has no mum. So we no longer have to be choshesh for mekach tovos. The Mishnah Achrona says no. She will not eat truma. Again, this is all Gzeira D'Rabbanan, until the chuppah. Ad shetikanes lechuppah. And the nisuin is complete. Either because we're afraid he won't set up a separate place for her outside her house, or because he won't necessarily check her out to find out if she has a mum. So that's the Mishnah Achrona. Okay. Now we're ready for our Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah says, Almana. Almana l'kohen gadol, grusha v'chalutz l'kohen hedjot. What are we talking about? We're talking about two different scenarios. One is a Bas Yisrael, and now she becomes Me'ureses in the following two scenarios, or a Bas Kohen. And a Bas Kohen, although she eats Truma in her father's house, here she's not going to be able to eat truma. Why? Because she is shomeres or mishtameres lebias avera. Why? She's an almana lekohen gadol or a grusha of a chalutza lekohen hedjot. Chalutza is the rabbanon, but doraisa grusha. Mina erisim. Now, what's the emphasis here on mina erisim? If it was after the suin, then she becomes a chalola. That's a doraisa psul. She's excluded from kahuna in two ways. Number one, she can no longer eat truma. She's a chalola. And number two, she can never marry a kohen. That's after the suin. But the Mishnah points out and emphasizes mina erisin. So mina erisin, she's not a chalola. There was no act of intimacy. But nevertheless, since she's shomeres lebias avera, lo yochlu b'truma, the Tanakama paskins that she cannot eat truma. It's almost as if we're anticipating that she's going to become a chalola. And who disagrees? Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Machshirin. They allow her to eat truma. Why? On a doraisa level, she's kinyan kaspo, and she's not a chalola. Because till the suin takes place with an act of bia, she did not become disqualified from kahuna. In fact, as we'll soon see in the Mishnah, if her husband dies or divorces her before Nisuin, before he takes her into the chuppah, then everybody agrees she's allowed to eat truma. So this psul of shomeres or mishtameres l'dvar vera is only a temporary psul. Once the marriage relationship terminates and it never reached its fruition of chuppah, she never became a chalola, she's no longer married mishtameres l'bias avera, everybody agrees she's allowed to eat truma. Again, obviously, that would only apply to a bas kohen. If she's a bas Yisrael, then after gerushin, there's no havamina that she can eat truma, or after almonas.
Right.
This armalu onis arshu mina nisuin, and then she's psula doraisa forevermore because she became a chalola, psulos. So it means that a bas kohen of that sort would never, ever be able to eat truma. She doesn't go back to Beis Avia. She's never allowed to marry a kohen. That's called chalolos. However, mina erisin, where there was no be'ila, and therefore there's no chalolos, ksheros. Now ksheros here comes, you have to sort of bifurcate it, split. If she got a gerushin from the kuna, then ksheros l'kuna just means that she's allowed to eat truma. Back in her father's house, she's a bas kohen, but she can never be married to a kohen because she's a grusha. But in the case of this armala, it means, number one, that she goes back to her father's house so she can eat truma, and number two, she's allowed to marry a kohen. Not a kohen gadol, but a kohen hedge. So the basic focus of this Mishnah, which the Gemara is now going to analyze, is a machlokes on a drabanan level. Is there a gzera drabanan called mishtameres lebias avera in the case where she's only meureses, either an almana lekohen gadol or a grusha to kohen hedjot? The Tanakama insists that she cannot eat truma, and that's a drabanan. And Rav Shimon and Rabbi Elazar rejected. She's not a chalola, and the rabbanan never passled her for truma. But we have to emphasize that even according to Tanakama, that the rabbanan made a gzera drabanan of Mishtameres Lebias Avera, that's only a temporary psul. If her husband dies, the Kohen Gadol dies, or the Kohen Hedjed in the case of a Grusha, before they, what's the word I want to use? Before they, they culminate, I'll use that word. I think it should be a better word. Before they culminate the marriage with Nisuin, so during the Erisin period, she became an Almana or a Grusha, then even the Rabbanan agree that she goes back to Beis Avia to eat Truma. She's not psula to a Kohen in the case of Almana. Why? Because it was Mina Erisin. So the whole issue of Mina Erisin is an psul Truma D'Rabbanan calls man that she's an Arusa. Once she becomes a Nesua to those two scenarios, Almana Kohen Gadol and Kohen Hedjed to a Grusha, then she's a Chalala. She can never marry a Kohen. She'll never eat Truma. That's called Be'ilah Poselos. All right. So now we'll see the Gemara. Now, our Mishnah starts with the Tanakama. He's not identified by name, but we'll see here in this Paisa that he is in fact Rabbi Meir. Tanya, Rabbi Meir, Kal v'chomer. I'm going to prove logically that once she was miskadeshes to a Kohen Bavera, then she can no longer eat Truma. That's during Erison. Again, during Nisuin, everybody agrees she's a Chalol. Now listen to this, Ira. What a strange Kal v'chomer. I couldn't wrap my head around this Kal v'chomer. Uma Kedushay Rishus. Rashi explains what's Kedushay Rishus. A Yisrael marries a Bas Yisrael. There's no Isur in the Kedushin. Ein Machilim B'Truma. His marriage, or her marriage to him, could not give her the rights to eat Truma. Is Kedushay Avera Lo Kolshkein? How much more so in the case of Almana L'Kohen Gadol or Grusha L'Kohen Hedjed, where there's an Avera in the Kedushin, certainly she cannot eat Truma. What is going on here? This Kal v'chomer made no sense to me. A Yisrael marries a Yisraelis. Is there a Havamina here that she would eat Truma? There's no Tzad Kahuna at all. What does that prove about a case where there's an Avera, but there's only Erison and there was no Nesuin? So Rab Shimon and Rab Elazar respond in this price, the obvious response. Lo im amar to be kedushay rishus. Shekein ein lo lahachil b'makom acher. The Yisrael could never be machil truma to his wife. What power does he have? He doesn't have the ability to eat truma. Tomar b'kedushay avera shekein yesh lo lahachil b'makom acher. If a Kohen would have been ma'ares a Bas Yisrael without any Avera, then he's machil ha-b'truma. So maybe he could be machil ha-b'truma even if there is an Avera. I don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no. I mean, she's not a chalala. So your Kal v'chomer is completely rejected. However, what the Gemara is going to do now, this is a very brilliant move. The Gemara is going to bring another case of Mishtameres Lebias Avera. The Gemara, and he's a Kohen, and the question is whether she can eat Truma. It's before the Bia, so she's not a Chalola. The Gemara is going to say that depends on the Machlokes between the Tanakama of Mishnah, who we identified as Rabbi Meir, on the one hand, L'chumra, and Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon on the other hand, Lakula. But through the analysis of this other case that we're adding, another example of the machlokus in our Mishnah, another application of the machlokus in our Mishnah, we're going to get an insight into the entire machlokus, what the issue is all about. And this is based on a statement of Rabbi Elazar. We got to be careful here. This is Rabbi Elazar, and not. This is, I guess you'd call it Rebbe Elazar, as opposed to actually. Even in that mission, it says Rabbi Elazar. Okay, forget it. But in any event, this is a statement of an Amora in the name of Rabbi Oshia. And what's the case here? What's the Mishtameres Lebias Avera here in this particular case? It's called the Ptsua Daka. The Torah says about a Ptsua Daka who has a Ptsia Bebeitzim Shlo in his testicles. The Torah says, Lo Yavo Ptsua Daka Ukrush Shuvcha Bekal Hashem. By the way, just on the side, I have a very close friend of mine who never had, he had cancer of the testicles, but he had only one testicle was removed. And it's gigantic machlokas about whether he's such a person is a ptsua daka. That would mean that he'd have to divorce his wife. And he got a psaka hora that we could rely on those shitos that a ptsua daka was injured in both of his testicles. So he was allowed to remain married. And he's still, Baruch Hashem, happily married today. But it's an actual case that I know of. Usually these things they don't put on the front pages of the local rag. You know what I mean? So now we have a case of a Kohen who's a Ptsua Daka. He still has Kedushas Kahuna and he eats Truma, but he's not allowed to marry a Bas Yisrael. And he went ahead for whatever reason and Kidesh Bas Yisrael. Once again, we have a situation of Mishtameres Lebias Avera because Ptsua Daka Lo Yova B'Kal Hashem. So the statement of Rav Oshia says, Banu L'Machlokas Rabbi Meir Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon. Where Rabbi Meir Yom Mishtameres Lebias Psula Doraisa Lo Achla. She cannot eat Truma, even though she's not a Chalola, and they didn't have a relationship yet, but nevertheless, she is designated for a Bias Avera, and that alone is enough to generate the Isa Drabanan, the Psul Drabanan of Truma. She doesn't eat Truma. Hanami Lo Achla. In other words, this is identical to the case in our Mishnah of Almana L'Kohen Gadol or Grusha L'Kohen Eja. L'Rabbi Elazar, Reb Shimon, the Amir Tameres, the Bia Psula Doraisa Achla, she continues to eat Truma. She's Kinyan Kaspo, and the Torah says that Ashes Kohen, once she's Kinyan Kaspo, can eat Truma. And it's talking about Shas Erison where there's no Chalolas. They were matir Almana L'Kohen Gadol and Grusha L'Kohen Eja. They'll be matir Psua Daka to a Bas Yisrael. If the Psua Daka is a Kohen, she will eat Truma. Anami Ochla, just like in the Mishnah, we're now on Daf Zion, just like in the Mishnah, where she was Mishtameres Lebias Avera in the case of Almana L'Kohen Gadol, etc. And yet Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon say she eats Truma, she's Kinyan Kaspo, and there's no Gzeira D'Rabbanan. The same thing by analogy will apply to Bas Yisrael, who's Mu'urasa to a Ptsua Daka Kohen. She could eat Truma Midin Kinyan Kaspo. We go back to the Doraisa Halacha. And she hasn't yet had any Be'ila, so she's not a Chalola. It's only during Erison. And that's Rav Oshia. Now let's stop here and put on our thinking caps. Rav Oshia added something to our Mishnah. In other words, he applied what you call the analysis of analogy. He's making an analogy. which is always a very kind of tenuous operation, methodology, an analogy to derive conclusions that are not in the Mishnah always requires, investigating with an electroscanning microscope. So let's analyze this. In the two cases of our Mishnah, of Almana l'Kohen Gadol and Grusha l'Kohen Hedjot, when we look at it from the perspective of the Kohen, or the Kohen Gadol, no, I just slugged myself up. I thought I had a good svar, but now I see it's not right. Wait, give me another minute here. Let's take case of. No, I don't have it. I thought I had something. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe I do have something. Let me try it one more time. See, I was focused on Rabbi Meir. Let me focus my attention on Rabbi Lazar Reb Shimon. Then Mekil, in the case of Almana, l'Kohen Gadol. Oh, I think I got it. In the case of Almana l'Kohen Gadol, the reason why they're Mekil, perhaps, is because there's no psul in the Ma'achil. The psul is in the Ocheles. What do I mean? What causes the Bias Avera here? Again, there is no Bias Avera. We're talking during Erison, but the potential for Bias Avera, if we look towards the future, it's the psul in the Isha. She's an Almana. She's a Grusha. There's no way that you can impinge, if you will, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but limit the ability of the Kohen to be machil based on the Kohen himself. He's a Kohen Gadol. He's a Kohen Hedjot. He can be machil. If you focus your attention on the machil, there's no issue. The issue is in the fact that she is excluded from this relationship. But Suadaka is much more fundamental. Suadaka can't be machil anyone. Lo yava b'kal Hashem. He's excluded from marriage. The psul is in the machil. In brisker terminology, we would say this afkas hagavra. The gavra is mufka from being machil b'truma. He himself is allowed to eat truma. He's a kohen, but there's no way within a marriage framework that he could be machil truma, because the Torah says he's not allowed to get married to a Jewish girl. So that even though Rabbi Lazar Reb Shimon are matir in a case of mishtameres lebias avera, that's only because at least a machil, meaning the Kohen himself, he's 100%. There's no pagam in the Kohen to be machil. The problem is that this particular woman is excluded from this marriage, and she becomes mishtameres lebias avera. But in the case of the suadaka, he himself could not be machil b'truma. I think I got it. I'm just anticipating what's going to come around the bend, because sometimes if you if you think about it logically on your own, then the Gemara becomes a little bit easier. So Gemara says, "Mimai When are they makil and they're allowing the Kohen to be machil the arusa truma, even though she's mishtameres l'bias avera? Eladi yeshlo, the Kohen has yeshlo lahachil. It's interesting. The Masechet adds one word in small print. Yeshlo koach lahachil. I think it's a critical word. Had he married any other woman except for this almana or this grusha, he would be machil. So he has the koach to be machil. So the gavra hamachil is not excluded from being machil. Aval hacham, in the case of Kohen who's to a daka, the elo, again, let's add the word koach lahachil, b'makom acher. He's also b'chol anoshim sheba'olam. He could never be machil any woman truma. Is low. How do you know, Rav Osher, which birdie whispered in your ear that Rabbi Lazar Reb Shimon would be makil and allow her to eat truma when she's married to a daka who could never ever be married to a Jewish woman legitimately and legally? How could he be machil truma? So I really think this gives us like an insight into the Mishnah. The Mishnah doesn't really analyze the machlokas between the Tanoim, but here we see a very important point about their machlokas. It's not all or nothing. It's not that Reb Shimon or Reb Elazar are makil straight across the board. They hold that Erison is Doraisas, King and Kaspo, let her eat Truma till Zayn Gesund Hate. No. They're also worried about this so-called marriage. But they said that let's look at the Kohen. And his status is such that he is a machil. He's the Kohen Gadol. He's a Kohen Hedja. He's got a good record. And now the Gemara slugs this up. Maybe Rabbi Lazar of Shimon would say about the Tuadaka exactly what we said about the Kohen Gadol and the Kohen Hedja. Why? He can be machil b'truma. The Tuadak is not mufka. Bivas Kohen, bivas gerim, if he marries a geyores. Now this is based on a sugya that I think we touched upon, if I'm not mistaken, which is called kahal gerim lo nikra kol. That a mamzer is allowed to marry a gioris, or a mamzeres is allowed to marry a ger. Why? Because kahal gerim lo nikra kol, which means that when the Torah says lo yoma b'kol, it means anyone with the exception of a ger, and a tzuadaka is allowed to marry a gioris. And if he's a Kohen, he'll be machil hatruma. Point to everybody. So you see that he's not mufka. He too has the potential to be machil with truma.
Right.
What blocks his ability to be machil with truma is the actual avera that this Erison would end up in truma in Nisuin with a bia hamachalelis. Right. So the same thing in Almana Kohen Gadol. The problem is that this marriage is such that it will end up in chalolos. It's mishtameres l'bias avera, and that's true for a psuadaka in 99 out of 100 cases. But there's always that one case in 100, which proves, the exception to the rule proves the rule itself, that he himself, the Kohen psuadaka, has the potential to be machil b'truma. It's not mufka. There's just a blockage of the Easter and the fact that she's mishtameres l'bias avera. But in the case of a giores, she's not mishtameres l'bias avera because kahal gei remain lo nikra kol, so he can be machil b'truma. So the Gemara is not happy with this. But I think it's for a technical reason. I'll try to figure out this technical reason. Gemara says, "V'hami boy boyle Rabbi Yochanan Rav Oshia." We're back to Rav Oshia himself. Rabbi Yochanan asked this very same question about a Kohen Petzuadaka who's married to a Bas Gerim. Can she eat truma or not? And he asked it to Rav Oshia. So Rav Oshia should have responded, absolutely, she can eat truma. But lo pashitly, he was stumped by the question, which means that Lamaisa, he's not going to allow this Bas Gerim to eat truma, even though she's married to a Kohen. And why not? Because this Kohen is to a Daka. So at the end of the day, halach lemaisa, according to Rabbi Yochi at least, a ptsua daka could never be machil b'truma if he's a kohen, even if he marries a bas gerim. And now we're back to square one. Why? We're stumped by the following question. How could Rabbi Yochi say that according to Rabbi Lazar of Shimon, a Mekel and a Mishnah and Alman, etc., would be Mekel in the case of a Psuadak? A Psuadak is a Gavra Mufta. He can never be Machel Truma, even to a Baskerim. And the proof of the pudding is because when Rabbi Yochanan asked this question, he addressed this question to Rabbi Oshia said, Lo Pashale, he didn't have an answer. So if he didn't have an answer, apparently he felt, at least a possibility you have to grant us, that a Ptsuadaka could not be Machil a Baskerim. If that be the case, then he's Mufkas at going from being Machil anyone Truma. So then we're back to square one. How could Rav Oshia make this analogy and jump a step? It's not a fair and valid analogy. And the Gemara answers based on Abaye. What did Abaye have to say? What did he throw into this whole rink? Yes, in Toronto you'd say a hockey rink, maybe, I don't know. So Itmar Abaye Omar, Abaye holds that you know why Rav Oshia made this analogy? Hoil umachila below yada'a. I'll tell you when a Kohen Ptsuadaka could be machil truma. Forget about a baskerim. That's not going to cut the mustard. But a case of below yada'a, which means that the marriage took place before he became a ptsuadaka. He became a ptsuadaka post-marriage. Okay, so what's below Yida'ah? Yida'ah means an intimate relationship. So let me read to you his note here. He writes, Im lo ba'aleha mishenasa ptsuadaka. So he's married to her, and they've been married for years. Then he had an injury, he became a ptsuadaka, but he hasn't had a relationship with her since he became a ptsuadaka. So now she's been eating truma for X number of years because she's married to a Kohen. Now he becomes a ptsuadaka. If he had a relationship with her after he became a ptsuadaka, then she becomes a chalola, she's psula mikuna, she cannot eat truma. But now they haven't consummated with an intimacy since he became a ptsuadaka. And Abai says that she continues to eat truma just like she did until he became a ptsuadaka. Very difficult, this Abai. Why? Because why is she eating truma? She's not eating truma al cheshbon the marriage now, but really it's al cheshbon the original marriage. She had a right to eat truma, And we're not going to remove that right and uproot that right when he becomes a P'tua Daka until she becomes a Chalola. But Lo Yida'a, there was no relationship, therefore she's allowed to eat Truma. So therefore, Abai says, you see that a P'tua Daka is not mufka from being machal truma. But again, I ask Abai the following question: is the P'tua Daka being machal the truma, or is she already, by virtue of the marriage, and there's no Mishtameres Bias Avera because the marriage was with a healthy guy, is she eating truma because he's being machal her truma, or is she eating truma simply because she's married to a Kohen? And once having granted and reached, attained that status of Eshes Kohen, again, Kinyan Kaspo, until that Kinyan Kaspo is broken, or if she becomes Chalola, she continues to eat Truma. But her rights to eat Truma are built on or standing on the shoulders of the original marriage that made her into Kinyan Kaspo. So therefore, Rava comes up with a different suggestion to explain Rav Oshia, that according to Daka is machil b'truma according to Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon. That means during Erison. Hoil umachila be'avadav v'shivchosav aknanim. This we left out of an introduction. We should have pointed out that Kinyan Kaspo is not just an arusa, but it's also the avodim knanim of a Kohen. If a Kohen owns an Eved Knani or a Shifra Knanis, that's also called Kinyan Kaspo. It's a pel of Allah when you think about it, that an Eved Knani is going to eat Truma, the holy Truma, because he's Kinyan Kaspo. Now, what happens if a Kohen P'tua Daka owns an Eved Knani or Shifra Knanis? The halacha is that the Eved and the Shifra are allowed to eat Truma. There's no nisuin here. There's no act that'll lead to chalolus. So Rava says, you see that a P'tua Daka could be machel b'truma. Again, who is he machel b'truma? An Eved or a Shivcha. But that's enough, according to Rava, to put the Kohen P'tua Daka into the category of a machil b'truma. He's not mufka from being machil b'truma. Abaylo amar Rava kinyan deishus mi kinyan deishus yalfinan v'lo yalfinan kivan deishus mi kinyan avodim. What kind of analogy is this? To say that a Kohen P'tua Daka be machil his wife truma, as long as she's an arusa, based on the fact that he can be machil his avodim truma, that's a different halacha. That's a halacha of Kinyan Eved. Kinyan Eved is a Kinyan mama. I hate to say it, but an Eved Knani is a Chefetz mama. Masha'enkein, in the case of a woman in Erison, that's a Kinyan Ishus. How can you make a comparison between the two? And I would vote here for Abaye. But Rava lo Amar Abaye, Shani Hasam Shekvar Achla. She already ate Truma when he was a healthy guy through Kinyan Kaspo, through the Ishus of Kinyan through Erison. And she continues to eat Truma even after he becomes a P'tua Daka until she becomes a Chalola Chas v'Shalom, right? And that compels Rava to bring a proof from Eved Knani. Abai can't tolerate the proof from Eved Knani because how can you compare Kinyan Ishus to a Kinyan Mammon? Abaye, how does Abai counter the argument of Rava? Shekvar ochlo lo amrin. Very, very abstract, ambiguous statement. I'm not going to apply your logic and your principle of kfar ochlo. So I'll tell you what I think my Rebbe would say. I'm just guessing. I didn't learn Yevamot with Rav Soloveitchik, but I think what he would say is that there are two ways of understanding Kinyan Kaspo and the ability of a Kohen to be machel b'truma. There's A or B. A real yeshiva shechakira. A means that it's like a pipe. Or let's say, for example, I mean, now they have electric cars, right? But let's say before electric cars, right? So you got to fill up your tank, and the gas goes into the tank continuously. As soon as you close the pipeline, the gas is not going to go into your tank. Same thing in Kinyan Kaspa. The Kohen is constantly, every second, being machil hatrum. Or no? It's her status, Chal Hashem, Kinyan Kaspa. And that status gives her the right to truma ad infinitum until we hit a blockage, and she's no longer Kinyan Kaspa, or alternatively, she becomes a Chalol. Other than that, it runs on its own. You don't have to constantly feed it. There's no din that every second he's being machel her truma. No. Her status, once attained as Kinyan Kaspo, gives her own personal status that she's allowed to eat truma. So Abaye understands the first way, that it's got to be constant. So you see that a P'tzua Daka is able to be machel truma. In this case, where she was married to him, he was healthy. But Rav understands, no, that it's a status halach. She became Kinyan Kaspo. She's no longer eating because he's being machil. Te'ilo tema hachi. If you're going to argue against it, like Rav does, and accept this far achla, is then Bas Yisrael shenises lekohen mi teichel. Now we're talking about a case of a woman who never ate truma until she got married to a Kohen. She got married to a Kohen, and they lived happily ever after, and she was eating truma until Nebuch Eretz Gishtarb. What happens? Assuming she doesn't have children, or no, I should say even more so if she has children, she continues to eat truma. Who's being machel her the truma? He's gone already. So there's no koch of the Baal of the Kohen to be machel of the truma. And Rava says, Hasam paka kinyane, hacha lo paka kinyane. Don't ask me from the case of a Bas Yisrael who was married to a Kohen and her husband, the Kohen, died. Oh, I'm sorry. I made one big boo-boo. I'm sorry. I apologize. Let's just backtrack for a minute, if we could rewind. The law is that a Bas Yisrael eats truma when she gets married to a Kohen up until the moment that he dies. Sorry. Once he dies, she can no longer eat truma. Says Abaye, what breaks up her rights to eat truma? It must be because she needs the Kohen to be machil of truma, that muscle that we gave from filling up the gas. It's got to be a constant pumping in of an energy force of Achalas truma, but he's dead, he can't be machil. But Rav, on the other hand, holds that you don't need this constant being machil with truma. All we need is a status change. So she had a status change. She was Kinyan Kaspo. So Rav answers, but Paka Kinyane, her status itself is temporary. As long as she's married to a Kohen, she's Kinyan Kaspo of a Kohen. And that status allows her to eat truma. So even after he becomes a P'tzua Daka, she continues to eat truma based on her status of Kinyan Kaspo. But here, when the Kohen Gadol dies, or the Kohen Ejo dies, then she's no longer Kinyan Kaspo. And of course, she loses her status, forfeits her status, and therefore she cannot eat truma. So we got up to Gufa over here on Daf Nun Zayin. I mean, we only began the Daf, but I think we did a decent job. Let me just make a note.
Very good.
Okay. All right, Ara. So let me wish you a week of Simcha, and we should continue the Simcha
you too.
of Pesach.
God willing.
And you should have a Gesundter Zummer.
You too, Scott.
Okay. All right. Call too. Bye-bye.
Be well.